They thought they could get away with it. Racist teenagers bully an elderly woman and destroy her home. But what happens next will turn their world upside down. Subscribe and post in the comments where you're watching from. The late afternoon sun bathed the house in a warm golden glow, casting soft shadows over the meticulously trimmed hedges and flower beds bursting with life. Mismatched petals of roses, hydrangeas, and daisies created a canvas of colors so vibrant that passers-by often stopped to admire the view. The house stood at the center of this blooming oasis, a small, modest structure with pale blue shutters and white painted weathering storms and sunshine. It was a home filled with stories, whispered through creaking floorboards and the rhythmic sway of a porch swing that had held generations of laughter and tears. Mildred Harriet, or Miss Harriet as the neighbors affectionately called her, sat on the porch, her delicate hands folded over the gardening gloves she had removed moments earlier. Her gaze wandered across the yard, pride and exhaustion mingling in her expression. She had spent the day tending to her flowers, her fingers worn and calloused from years of coaxing life from the soil. The garden was her sanctuary, her art, and her refuge. Every bloom had a story, every patch of green a memory tied to someone she loved. As she leaned back in her rocking chair, the sound of children's laughter floated faintly on the breeze. Harriet turned her head toward the source, a group of boys tossing a basketball on the street corner near her house. They were rowdy and loud, their sneakers slapping against the pavement in erratic rhythms. Harriet recognized them as the new kids from across the street, the Wilson boys. The Wilson family had moved in only a week ago, their arrival marked by the rumble of a large moving truck and the hurried unloading of furniture under the stern gaze of their father, a tall, broad man with a permanent scowl etched into his face. Harriet had greeted them warmly on their first day, carrying over a basket of fresh muffins as a welcome gift. The boys had accepted them reluctantly, muttering thanks under their breath, while their father gave her a curt nod before retreating inside. Since then, Harriet had observed the family in bits and pieces. The mother rarely appeared outside, and the boys, 3 of them, all in their early teens, seemed to spend most of their time roaming the neighborhood in a tight, inseparable pack. They were loud, brash, and often left a trail of litter in their wake. Harriet had caught them a few times, loitering near her garden, whispering and pointing at her flowers. Once she had found a broken rose bush, its stem cruelly snapped in half. At the time she had chalked it up to an accident, but something in the way the boys had avoided her gaze afterward made her wonder. The ball bounced loudly, pulling Harriet from her thoughts. The boys had moved closer now, their voices sharper, laced with a kind of edge that felt out of place in the quiet suburban street. Harriet frowned, watching as the eldest boy, Jake, she remembered his name, pushed his younger brother aside roughly, snatching the ball from his hand. The others laughed, but the laughter held no warmth. Harriet sighed and turned her gaze back to her garden. She had learned long ago not to involve herself in other people's disputes unless invited. Her life had been filled with enough struggles, enough battles fought and wounds nursed. Her garden was her peace now, her haven from a world that often seemed intent on tearing itself apart. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Harriet rose from her chair. The day's work had left her tired, and the cool evening air was beginning to settle in. She gathered her gloves and tools, placing them neatly on the small table by the door before stepping inside. The familiar creak of the floorboards greeted her, and she paused for a moment, letting the warmth of her home wrap around her like an old friend. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of a fan in the living room. Photographs lined the walls, snapshots of a life well lived. There was one of her late husband, Charles, standing in the garden with a wide grin, holding up a freshly picked basket of tomatoes. Another showed their daughter as a child, her hair in pigtails, sitting on the porch swing with a book in her lap. Harriet ran her fingers lightly over the frames, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. The sound of something hitting the side of the house jolted her out of her reverie. A sharp, unmistakable thud, followed by muffled laughter. Harriet's heart sank as she hurried back to the porch, her hands clutching the doorframe. The Wilson boys were now in her yard, their ball rolling across her carefully manicured lawn. Jake bent down to pick it up, his foot crushing a patch of daisies in the process. He glanced up and met Harriet's gaze, his expression defiant. "Get out of my garden," Harriet said, her voice steady but firm. She stepped onto the porch, her posture straight, despite the ache in her knees. The boys hesitated for a moment before Jake snorted, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "Relax, lady. It's just some flowers." "They're not just flowers," Harriet replied, her tone cold. "Now leave." The younger boys shifted uncomfortably, but Jake stood his ground. "Whatever," he muttered, kicking the ball to his brother before turning and walking away. The others followed, glancing back at her with a mixture of guilt and defiance. Harriet watched them go, her jaw tight. She bent down to inspect the damage, her hands trembling slightly as she touched the crushed petals. A wave of sadness washed over her, followed by a spark of anger she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she wondered if the peace she had worked so hard to build was beginning to crack. As the evening deepened into night, Harriet sat alone in her living room, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her chest. The sound of laughter from across the street drifted through the open window, mingling with the chirp of crickets. Harriet closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting to the past, to the battles she had fought and the strength she had once carried. Tomorrow, she decided, she would plant new flowers. The morning arrived with a soft glow, the sunlight peeking through Harriet's lace curtains and pooling on the hardwood floor. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the kettle in the kitchen. Harriet moved through her morning routine with practiced ease, her hands steady as she poured herself a cup of tea and sat at the small kitchen table. The events of the previous evening lingered in her mind like a shadow, and she found herself staring out the window toward the garden. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to make her heart ache. The patch of daisies Jake had trampled now lay flattened, their once vivid petals dulled and torn. A few snapped stems from the rose bushes hinted at other careless steps. Harriet took a sip of her tea, the warmth doing little to soothe the growing unease in her chest. She had seen these kinds of cracks before, not in her garden, but in the fabric of her own life. Small moments of disrespect and disregard could grow into something much larger if left unchecked. She thought of her younger years, of battles fought for rights that should have never needed defending, and of the quiet strength she had learned to carry herself with. Harriet rose from her chair, determination sparking in her eyes. She would not let her sanctuary crumble under the weight of thoughtlessness. Pulling on her gardening gloves, she stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against her face. The scent of earth and dew greeted her as she knelt beside the daisies, carefully trimming away the damaged blooms. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if tending to her garden could somehow mend the other fractures she sensed forming around her. She worked through the morning, her focus so intense that she barely noticed when a figure approached the edge of her yard. It wasn't until she heard the hesitant sound of a child clearing their throat that she looked up. Standing just beyond the garden gate was the youngest Wilson sibling, a girl Harriet guessed to be no older than 13. The girl had long dark hair tied in a loose ponytail, and her wide brown eyes darted nervously between Harriet and the ground. She held something in her hands, a small pot with a single sprig of lavender planted in it. Hi, the girl said, her voice soft. I brought this for your flowers. I mean, for the ones Jake messed up. Harriet straightened, brushing soil from her gloves. That's very thoughtful of you, she said, her voice gentle but cautious. What's your name, child? Katie, the girl replied, taking a tentative step forward. I'm sorry about what happened yesterday. My brothers, they're just careless, Harriet finished for her, but you didn't seem to be part of it. Katie shrugged, looking away. It's easier not to argue with them. They don't listen anyway. Harriet studied her for a moment, noting the way Katie fidgeted with the edge of her sweater, her shoulders drawn inward as if trying to make herself smaller. Harriet recognized that posture. It was the stance of someone used to being overlooked, someone who had learned to stay quiet to avoid drawing attention. Would you like to help me plant this? Harriet asked, nodding toward the pot of lavender. Katie's eyes widened slightly, and she hesitated before nodding. Together, they found a spot near the damaged daisies. Harriet handed Katie a small spade and guided her on how to dig a proper hole for the plant. As they worked, Harriet spoke in a calm, steady tone, sharing little anecdotes about her garden and the effort it took to maintain. Every flower here has its own story, Harriet said, patting the soil around the lavender. They're like people in that way. They need care and patience to grow strong. Katie glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable passing across her face. Do you think people can grow strong even if no one takes care of them? The question hung in the air, surprising Harriet with its weight. She set down her gloves and met Katie's gaze. Sometimes they can, she said after a moment. But it's harder, much harder. Katie nodded slowly, her fingers brushing the newly planted lavender. Harriet wondered what kind of life this girl was living behind the walls of her family's home. Before Harriet could say more, the sound of an angry voice cut through the peaceful morning. Katie! The sharp bark made both of them flinch. Harriet looked up to see a tall, broad man storming across the street toward her garden. It was Mr. Wilson, his face flushed with irritation. Behind him, the two older boys, Jake and Mike, followed with smirks that sent a chill down Harriet's spine. What are you doing over here? Mr. Wilson demanded, his voice booming as he stopped just short of the garden gate. I told you to stay out of other people's business. Katie scrambled to her feet, clutching the spade like a lifeline. I was just helping, Harriet interjected, stepping forward. Her voice was calm but firm, her gaze steady as she met Mr. Wilson's scowl. She was helping me plant a flower. Mr. Wilson snorted, his eyes narrowing. That so? Well, maybe you should stick to planting your own flowers and leave my kids alone. Harriet's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. I'm not sure teaching kindness counts as interference. Jake laughed, a sharp, mocking sound, while Mike elbowed him in the ribs. Katie shrank back, her earlier confidence wilting under her father's glare. Come on, Mr. Wilson growled, grabbing Katie by the arm. We're going home. Katie cast a quick, apologetic glance at Harriet before being dragged away. The older boys lingered for a moment, their expressions defiant. Jake kicked at a stone, sending it skittering toward the garden. Nice flowers, he sneered, before following his father. Harriet stood still, her heart pounding as the Wilsons retreated. She glanced down at the lavender Katie had planted, its small, delicate leaves trembling slightly in the breeze. A spark of anger flickered within her, tempered by a growing sense of resolve. The cracks in her peaceful world were becoming harder to ignore, but Harriet was no stranger to mending what others sought to break. The morning after Katie's visit began with an unsettling silence. Harriet noticed it as soon as she stepped onto her porch. The usual hum of life, the soft murmur of neighbors exchanging pleasantries, the distant bark of a dog, seemed muted, as if the entire street were holding its breath. Harriet suspected why. Yesterday's confrontation with Mr. Wilson and his boys had cast a shadow over her otherwise peaceful corner of the world. She sipped her tea, her eyes scanning the garden. The lavender Katie had planted the day before stood out against the bruised patch of daisies, its fragile stems swaying slightly in the breeze. Harriet had stayed up late thinking about the girl, her hesitant questions, her anxious fidgeting, the way she seemed caught between a desire to reach out and a fear of stepping too far. Harriet's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She glanced up to see the Wilson boys walking down the street. Jake was in the lead, his shoulders squared and his stride lazy but purposeful. Mike followed close behind, his expression a mirror of his brother's defiance. Katie trailed at a distance, her gaze fixed on the ground. The trio paused near Harriet's fence. Jake leaned against the post, his arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. Harriet set her cup down and rose, stepping to the edge of the porch. "Good morning," she said, her tone calm, but carrying an edge of warning. Jake tilted his head, pretending to consider her greeting. "Morning," he drawled, though the word dripped with mockery. Mike snickered, kicking at a loose stone in the dirt. Katie stayed back, her arms wrapped around herself. Harriet's eyes flicked to her briefly before returning to Jake. "Do you need something?" Harriet asked, keeping her voice steady. She refused to let the boy's arrogance rattle her. Jake shrugged. "Just thought we'd stop by and check out the garden. Looks like someone's been busy." Harriet's jaw tightened. "You're welcome to admire it from the street, but if you're planning to step inside, I suggest you reconsider." Jake straightened, his smirk fading slightly. For a moment his eyes flickered with uncertainty, but it was quickly replaced by a glint of challenge. "What if we don't?" Harriet didn't flinch. She stepped down from the porch, closing the distance between them. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each step a quiet declaration of resolve. When she reached the gate, she placed a hand on it, her fingers curling lightly around the weathered wood. "Then we'll have a problem," she said, her voice low but firm. For a few tense moments, they stared at each other. Jake's bravado faltered under her unwavering gaze. Mike shifted uncomfortably, glancing between his brother and Harriet. Even Katie looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Jake finally broke the silence with a laugh, though it sounded forced. "Relax, lady, we're just messing around." "Messing around," Harriet repeated, her tone sharp. "Is that what you call tearing up someone's garden? Throwing rocks at their windows? Harassing a woman who's done nothing to you?" The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Jake's smirk vanished completely, replaced by a scowl. "Come on," he muttered, turning away abruptly. "This place is boring anyway." Mike hesitated, casting one last look at Harriet before trailing after his brother. Katie lingered for a moment, her gaze darting between Harriet and the retreating boys. Harriet offered her a small, reassuring nod, and Katie hurried to catch up. As they disappeared down the street, Harriet let out a slow breath. Her heart was racing, but she refused to let it show. She turned back to her garden, her eyes falling on the lavender once more. It stood tall and defiant, a small but potent reminder of resilience. Later that afternoon, Harriet decided to pay a visit to her closest neighbor, Mrs. Crane. The elderly woman lived alone in a house just a few doors down. She had been a kind but reserved presence in the neighborhood for as long as Harriet could remember. Harriet suspected she had seen yesterday's confrontation, as she often sat by her window, watching the world go by. Mrs. Crane greeted Harriet with a warm smile when she arrived. They settled on the porch with glasses of iced tea, the summer heat softened by the shade of a large oak tree. "I saw those boys hanging around your place this morning," Mrs. Crane said after a while, her tone cautious. "They're trouble, Harriet. Mark my words." "I'm beginning to see that," Harriet replied, swirling the ice in her glass. "But I don't think the problem starts with them. It starts in that house of theirs." Mrs. Crane nodded knowingly. "Their father, you mean?" "Yes," Harriet said, her voice firm. "He's teaching them to hate, and those boys, they're too young to understand the damage they're doing to themselves and others." Mrs. Crane sighed, her gaze distant. "It's a shame. This street used to be so quiet, peaceful." "It still can be," Harriet said, though she wasn't entirely sure if she believed it. "But peace doesn't come without effort." Mrs. Crane reached over and patted Harriet's hand. "You've always been the strong one, dear. I just hope you don't wear yourself out trying to fix something that might not want fixing." Harriet smiled faintly but didn't reply. She finished her tea and said her goodbyes, her mind heavy with Mrs. Crane's words. That evening, as Harriet prepared for bed, she heard the familiar sound of laughter outside. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, accompanied by the occasional thud of something hitting the pavement. Harriet peered out the window and saw the Wilson boys gathered near her garden once again. Jake had a stick in his hand, which he used to jab at the flowers along the edge of her yard. Harriet felt a flicker of anger but pushed it aside. She wouldn't let them bait her into a confrontation tonight. Instead, she stepped back from the window and turned off the light. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find a way to reach out to Katie, to the neighbors, to anyone who might stand with her. The cracks in her peaceful world were growing, but Harriet was determined not to let them shatter it entirely. The days that followed were like a storm brewing on the horizon, subtle shifts in the air, small but persistent reminders that something was amiss. Harriet woke each morning with a sense of unease, her once quiet neighborhood now a stage for tension that seemed to grow with every passing hour. The Wilson boys had made her garden their unofficial battleground, their nightly escapades leaving behind broken stems, trampled blooms, and the occasional crude drawing scrawled on her fence with chalk. On the third morning after her confrontation with Jake, Harriet stepped outside to find her rose bushes vandalized again. Several branches had been snapped, their blooms scattered like fallen soldiers across the garden bed. A small, sharp intake of breath escaped her as she bent down to collect the ruined flowers. She handled them gently, as if their bruised petals still deserved respect. Harriet glanced toward the Wilson house. The blinds in the front window shifted slightly, a fleeting movement she knew too well. Someone was watching. She straightened, her posture calm but firm, and carried the damaged roses back to her porch. If the Wilsons thought they could intimidate her, they were sorely mistaken. That evening, Harriet decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. After carefully tending to what remained of her garden, she put on her best coat and walked the short distance to the local police station. The small building was a familiar sight, its worn brick exterior a testament to decades of service. Inside, the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper. The officer at the desk, a young man with tired eyes and a nameplate that read Officer Martinez, looked up as Harriet approached. "Good evening, ma'am. How can I help you?" Harriet explained the situation, her voice steady despite the frustration simmering beneath the surface. She described the repeated acts of vandalism, the harassment, the escalating tension. Officer Martinez listened attentively, nodding occasionally, but Harriet couldn't miss the way his gaze flickered toward the clock on the wall. When she finished, there was a brief silence. Martinez leaned back in his chair, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry to hear about what's been happening, Miss Harriet, but, well, these things can be tricky. It sounds like it's just some kids being kids." Harriet's lips tightened. "Kids being kids don't leave my property looking like a battlefield, officer, and they certainly don't laugh in my face when I tell them to stop." "I understand your frustration," he said, his tone placating. "But without concrete evidence, there's not much we can do. Have you considered installing security cameras? That might help us build a case if the behavior continues." Harriet stared at him for a moment, her disappointment sharp and bitter. She had expected resistance, but hearing it stated so plainly still stung. "So, until then, I'm just supposed to endure this?" Martinez hesitated. I'll make a note of your complaint, and if anything escalates further, don't hesitate to call us." Harriet thanked him curtly and left the station, her steps brisk and purposeful. The cool evening air bit at her cheeks, but it did little to temper the fire in her chest. She had fought too hard and for too long in her life to be dismissed so easily. As she walked back home, Harriet found herself replaying moments from her past. She remembered the sit-ins at segregated diners, the marches through streets lined with jeering crowds, the quiet determination that had carried her through each battle. Back then, the stakes had been monumental. Freedom, equality, dignity. Yet this smaller fight, this defense of her garden and her home, felt no less significant. It wasn't just about flowers. It was about standing her ground against a tide of disrespect and hatred. When Harriet arrived home, she found Katie waiting by her front gate. The girl looked nervous, her hands stuffed into the pockets of an oversized sweatshirt. She glanced up as Harriet approached, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Katie," Harriet said, surprised, "what are you doing out here?" I just wanted to check on you," Katie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw Jake and Mike out here earlier. Did they—" She trailed off, her gaze drifting toward the broken roses. "They did," Harriet said simply. She opened the gate and gestured for Katie to follow her inside. They sat on the porch steps, the soft glow of the porch light casting long shadows across the yard. For a while, neither of them spoke. Harriet let the silence stretch, sensing that Katie needed time to gather her thoughts. Finally, the girl broke the stillness. "They're not bad people," Katie said, her voice trembling. "Jake and Mike, they're just scared." "Scared of what?" Harriet asked gently. Katie hesitated. "Dad, he's not like you. He doesn't think people should, mix. He says it's dangerous, that it ruins everything." Harriet felt a pang of sadness for the girl sitting beside her. Katie's words revealed so much about the environment she was growing up in, about the forces shaping her brothers into the boys they were becoming. "And what about you, Katie?" Harriet asked softly. "What do you think?" Katie's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I don't know," she admitted. "Sometimes I think Dad's wrong, but then I think, what if he's not? What if the world really is like he says it is?" Harriet reached over and placed a hand on Katie's shoulder, her touch light but reassuring. "The world can be a hard place," she said, "but it's also full of beauty and kindness if you know where to look. Don't let someone else's fear keep you from seeing that." Katie nodded, her expression thoughtful. She sat with Harriet for a while longer before quietly excusing herself. Harriet watched her disappear into the night, her heart heavy with both hope and worry. The next morning, Harriet woke to find her garden in worse shape than ever. The lavender Katie had planted was uprooted, its fragile roots exposed to the sun. The word witch was scrawled across her fence in bold, jagged letters. Harriet's breath caught in her throat as she surveyed the damage. This was no longer just carelessness or childish mischief. This was a message. She spent the day repairing what she could, her movements slow but steady. Her neighbors passed by occasionally, their expressions a mix of sympathy and avoidance. No one stopped to help. No one asked what had happened. That evening, Harriet sat alone in her living room, staring at the empty photo frame on the mantelpiece. It had once held a picture of her and her late husband Charles standing in the garden they had built together. She had taken it down earlier that day, unable to bear the reminder of what had been lost. But as the shadows lengthened and the house grew quiet, she realized something. The fight wasn't over, not for her, and not for her garden. She would plant new flowers, she would repaint the fence, and she would show the Wilsons and anyone else who cared to look that resilience wasn't just a word, it was a way of life. The quiet of the evening felt unnatural, as if the air itself had braced for an impending storm. Harriet sat on her porch swing, the creak of the old chains breaking the silence. Her garden, once a sanctuary, now bore the scars of weeks of mistreatment. The broken rose bushes, the scattered petals, and the uprooted lavender told a story she wished she didn't have to live. Yet Harriet refused to retreat. She had seen too many battles in her life to let a few angry boys and their father intimidate her into silence. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. Harriet lingered on the porch, her gaze drifting toward the Wilson house across the street. The lights were on, the shadows of figures moving behind the curtains. Harriet's mind wandered to Katie. The girl's timid questions from a few nights ago still lingered in her thoughts, along with the worry that Katie's quiet strength might not be enough to resist the toxic environment around her. The streetlights flickered on as the night deepened. Harriet rose from the swing, her knees protesting, as she climbed the steps back into the house. She locked the door and secured the windows, a habit that had become second nature in recent days. As she moved through the house, turning off lights and preparing for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It started with a faint sound, a rustling at the edge of her consciousness. Harriet froze, her hand hovering over the light switch in the kitchen. The noise came again, louder this time, a shuffle, a scrape, the unmistakable sound of feet crunching against gravel. She moved to the window and peered out, her heart sinking at the sight before her. The Wilson boys were in her yard again, but this time they weren't alone. Jake stood at the center, a can of spray paint in his hand. Mike was beside him, holding a bat slung over his shoulder, his posture cocky and unbothered. Two other boys, whom Harriet didn't recognize, lingered at the edge of the property, laughing and whispering. They carried flashlights, their beams darting across the garden like searching eyes. Harriet's breath caught as she saw Jake approach her fence. With deliberate movements, he began spraying crude, jagged letters across the wooden slats. Mike followed, swinging the bat at the flowers nearest the fence, the sound of snapping stems breaking the stillness of the night. Harriet's pulse quickened as anger and fear fought for dominance in her chest. She grabbed her phone and dialed the police, her fingers trembling as she pressed the buttons. The line rang, each tone stretching endlessly in her ears, until finally a voice answered. "This is 911, what's your emergency?" Harriet's voice was steady despite the turmoil within her. "This is Harriet Daniels at 112 Maple Street. I have trespassers on my property causing damage. I need assistance immediately." The operator assured her that officers were on their way, but Harriet knew how slow the response could be in a quiet suburban neighborhood like hers. She placed the phone down and turned back to the window. Jake and Mike had moved closer to the house now, their laughter loud and brash. The two other boys stood near the gate, occasionally glancing up and down the street, as if keeping watch. Harriet's gaze drifted toward the kitchen counter where a heavy flashlight lay. She grabbed it and moved toward the front door, her heart pounding with each step. She knew confronting them was risky, but she couldn't stand idly by while her home was desecrated. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the flashlight held tightly in her hand. The sound of the door startled the boys, and they turned to face her, their expressions a mix of surprise and defiance. "That's enough," Harriet called out, her voice firm and unwavering. "Get off my property." Jake's smirk returned as he sauntered closer to the porch steps. "Or what?" he taunted, the spray can still in his hand. "You gonna call the cops? Go ahead, by the time they get here, we'll be long gone." Mike laughed, swinging the bat in lazy arcs. "Yeah, old lady? What are you gonna do, hit us with that flashlight?" The other boys snickered, their bravado feeding off each other. Harriet held her ground, her gaze locked on Jake. "I've called the police," she said. "They're on their way, and if you don't leave now, I'll make sure they find you here." Jake's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "We're not scared of you," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. Before Harriet could respond, a voice cut through the tension, a high, panicked shout from across the street. "Jake, Mike, stop it." Everyone turned to see Katie standing on the Wilsons' front porch, her small frame illuminated by the porch light. She was shaking, her fists clenched at her sides. "Go back inside, Katie," Jake called, his tone irritated. "This has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," Katie shouted back, her voice cracking. "You're ruining everything. Just go home." Harriet felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or gratitude, as she watched Katie descend the steps, her fear overridden by determination. The other boys exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence wavering in the face of Katie's outburst. Jake glared at his sister, his jaw tight. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and threatening. Katie stood her ground. "I know enough to see that you're acting like a bully. This isn't right, Jake. You know it's not." For a moment, the tension hung heavy in the air, the only sound the distant wail of a siren growing louder. Jake's eyes flickered toward the street, where the glow of approaching headlights signaled the arrival of the police. He cursed under his breath and tossed the spray can aside. "Let's go," he barked at the others. Mike hesitated but eventually followed his brother, the two strangers trailing behind. As they disappeared into the shadows, Harriet felt her knees weaken with relief. Katie lingered at the edge of the yard, her face pale and drawn. Harriet stepped toward her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Katie," she said softly. "That was very brave." Katie shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know they'd go this far." "It's not your fault," Harriet assured her. "But you stopped them tonight. That means something." The police arrived moments later, their flashing lights casting harsh beams across the yard. Harriet explained the situation to the officers, who took notes and promised to follow up. As they spoke, Katie slipped away, retreating to the safety of her house. When the chaos finally settled and the officers departed, Harriet stood alone in her garden. The damage was worse than ever. Flowers crushed, soil overturned, the fence defaced with hateful words. Yet as she surveyed the wreckage, she felt a flicker of resolve reignite within her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Harriet would rebuild, just as she always had, and she wouldn't stop until her garden and her peace were restored. The morning sun rose over Harriet's battered garden, casting light on the destruction from the previous night. The crude words scrawled on the fence were a stark reminder of how far things had escalated. As Harriet stood on her porch, surveying the wreckage, she felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. Yet beneath it burned a familiar resolve, one that had carried her through struggles far greater than this. She knew she couldn't face this alone. Her attempts to manage the situation quietly had failed, and the Wilsons' behavior had crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. Harriet decided it was time to rally her neighbors, to remind them that standing by in silence was not the same as staying neutral. Inaction had its consequences, and this neighborhood needed to understand that. By midday, Harriet was knocking on doors. She started with Mrs. Crane, who greeted her with a worried frown. "Harriet," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I saw what they did to your garden. It's awful, truly awful." "It is," Harriet replied, her tone firm but not accusatory. "And it's not just my garden, Mrs. Crane. It's the neighborhood. Their actions affect all of us. If we let this go unchecked, what's next?" Mrs. Crane hesitated, her gaze drifting to the floor. I just don't want any trouble. You know how these things can spiral." Harriet placed a reassuring hand on her neighbor's arm. "The trouble has already found us. Ignoring it won't make it go away, but standing together, that might make them think twice." Mrs. Crane nodded reluctantly, and Harriet moved on. Door by door, she spoke to her neighbors, sharing her story and urging them to come together. Some were sympathetic but hesitant, their fear of confrontation holding them back. Others were more supportive, their anger at the Wilsons' behavior spurring them into action. By the end of the day, Harriet had gathered a small group willing to meet and discuss how to address the situation. The meeting took place that evening in Harriet's living room. The group was modest. Mrs. Crane, the Hernandez family from down the street, and a young couple who had recently moved in, but their presence filled the room with a sense of solidarity Harriet hadn't felt in weeks. "This isn't just about my garden," Harriet began, her voice steady and resolute. "It's about creating a community where we all feel safe and respected. The Wilson boys are acting out because they think no one will stop them. We need to show them that we won't tolerate this behavior." The group murmured in agreement, though some faces were lined with worry. Mrs. Hernandez spoke up, her expression determined. "They've been throwing trash into our yard, too. I didn't want to say anything, but now I see that staying quiet isn't helping." Andrea nodded. "Exactly. The more we ignore them, the bolder they'll get. But if we stand together, we can make it clear that this kind of behavior has no place here." The discussion continued late into the night, with the group brainstorming ways to address the issue. They decided to draft a letter to the Wilson family, signed by all the neighbors willing to stand in solidarity. The letter would outline their concerns and demand accountability. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The next morning, Harriet woke to the sound of voices outside. She peered through the window and saw a small crowd gathered at the Wilsons' front yard. Mr. Wilson stood on the porch, his broad frame towering over the group. He was shouting, his face red with anger, as Mrs. Crane attempted to hand him the letter. "I don't need a bunch of busybodies telling me how to raise my kids," Mr. Wilson bellowed, his voice carrying across the street. Harriet stepped outside, her presence drawing the attention of the crowd. She walked calmly toward the Wilson house, her back straight and her expression composed. When she reached the group, she placed a hand on Mrs. Crane's shoulder and took the letter from her trembling hands. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson," Harriet said evenly. "We're here because your son's actions have crossed a line. This letter outlines our concerns and our expectations moving forward." Mr. Wilson sneered. "You think you can tell me how to run my family? Who do you think you are?" "I think I'm someone who deserves respect," Harriet replied. "And I think this neighborhood deserves better than what your family has been giving it." The crowd murmured their agreement, emboldened by Harriet's calm defiance. Mr. Wilson's face darkened, but before he could respond, Katie appeared on the porch, her expression anxious. "Dad," she said quietly, "maybe we should just listen." "Stay out of this, Katie," Mr. Wilson snapped, his tone harsh. "This is none of your business." "It is her business," Harriet said firmly, her gaze steady. "She lives here too, and if she's brave enough to speak up, perhaps you should be brave enough to listen." Mr. Wilson's jaw clenched, his fists tightened at his sides. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. But before the confrontation could escalate further, a voice interrupted. "She's right," Jake said, stepping out from behind his father. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by an uneasy vulnerability. "We've been acting like jerks. I'm sorry." The crowd fell silent, stunned by the admission. Even Mr. Wilson looked taken aback, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion. Jake glanced at Harriet, his expression earnest. "I didn't think about how much we were hurting you. Or anyone else." Harriet studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes searching his face for any hint of insincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Acknowledging the harm is the first step. The next is making amends." Jake nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. Mr. Wilson looked as though he wanted to protest, but the weight of the moment kept him silent. Oh. Katie stepped forward, her hand brushing Jake's arm in a silent gesture of support. The crowd began to disperse, the tension easing as neighbors returned to their homes. Harriet lingered for a moment, watching as Mr. Wilson retreated inside, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She couldn't say whether this confrontation would lead to lasting change, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. As Harriet returned to her porch, she glanced at her garden. It still bore the scars of the boy's actions, but she knew those wounds would heal. Flowers could be replanted, fences repainted. What mattered most was the strength of the roots beneath the soil, and Harriet's roots ran deep. The morning after the confrontation felt different. The air seemed lighter, the tension that had weighed down the neighborhood dissipating like mist under the sun. Harriet woke early, as was her habit, and made her way to the porch with her tea. The garden still bore the marks of recent destruction, but for the first time in weeks, Harriet felt something close to peace. She spent the morning tending to her flowers. The damaged lavender was carefully replanted, its fragile roots cradled by fresh soil. Harriet hummed quietly to herself as she worked, her hands steady despite the lingering ache in her joints. Gardening had always been her solace, a way to rebuild what others sought to tear down. Each bloom she nurtured felt like an act of defiance, a quiet declaration that she would not be broken. As she finished, Harriet heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Jake standing at the gate, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His shoulders were hunched, his expression uncertain. "Miss Harriet," he began, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything, for the garden, for the fence, for being a jerk." Harriet straightened, brushing dirt from her gloves. She studied him for a moment, noting the tension in his posture, the way his eyes darted nervously. This was not the same boy who had laughed at her garden's destruction or taunted her from the street. This was a boy carrying the weight of regret. "I appreciate that, Jake," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "But words are only the beginning. What matters is what you do next." Jake nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I know. That's why I brought this." He stepped forward, holding out a small pot with a single marigold blooming inside. "I thought maybe I could help you plant it." Harriet's chest tightened at the gesture. She took the pot from him, her fingers brushing the cool ceramic. "Marigolds are strong flowers," she said, her tone thoughtful. "They thrive in tough conditions. A good choice." Jake offered a small, sheepish smile. "I just thought they looked nice." Harriet chuckled softly and motioned for him to follow her into the garden. Together they found a spot near the fence where the soil was loose and ready. Harriet handed Jake a spade and guided him as he dug the hole, her voice steady and patient. It reminded her of the day Katie had helped her plant the lavender, a memory that now felt like a turning point. As they worked, Harriet asked gently, "What made you change your mind, Jake?" Jake paused, his hands stilling on the spade. Katie," he admitted after a moment. "She wouldn't stop talking about you, about how strong you are, how you didn't give up even when I was awful." Harriet smiled softly. "Katie's a good girl. She sees the world more clearly than most." "Yeah," Jake said, his voice tinged with guilt. "She's braver than I am. I didn't know how to stop. And Dad, he makes it hard." Harriet placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Change is never easy, Jake, but it starts with small steps, like planting a marigold." They finished the planting in silence, the marigold standing tall and bright against the soil. Jake brushed his hands on his jeans, glancing at Harriet. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make things right." "It's never too late to start," Harriet replied, her voice warm. Jake left shortly after, his steps lighter than when he had arrived. Harriet watched him go, a glimmer of hope stirring in her chest. Change was slow, often painful, but it was possible. Jake's small act of kindness felt like proof of that. Later that day, Harriet was sitting on her porch when Katie appeared, holding a stack of fresh boards and a can of paint. Her face was flushed with effort, but her eyes sparkled with determination. "Jake told me what he did," Katie said, setting the materials down. "I thought maybe we could fix the fence together." Harriet's smile widened. "I'd like that very much." For the next few hours, the two of them worked side by side, replacing the damaged boards and painting over the hateful words. Their movements were rhythmic, almost meditative, the sound of the hammer and the brush strokes blending into a soothing cadence. As they worked, Katie shared stories about her brothers, about her struggles to navigate a household ruled by fear and anger. "I always thought I had to keep quiet," Katie said, her voice soft. "But you showed me that speaking up can make a difference." Harriet paused, looking at the girl who had grown so much in just a few weeks. "Your voice is powerful, Katie. Don't ever let anyone take that from you." By the time they finished, the fence looked almost new. The fresh paint gleamed in the afternoon sun, a symbol of resilience and renewal. Katie stepped back to admire their work, her smile radiant. "It's beautiful," she said. "It is," Harriet agreed, though she wasn't just talking about the fence. That evening, as Harriet sat on her porch, sipping her tea, she noticed something unusual. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered near her garden, their faces curious and cautious. Mrs. Crane was among them, along with the Hernandez family and the young couple who had attended the meeting. Even Mr. Wilson lingered at the edge of the group, his expression unreadable. Harriet rose and walked to the garden gate, her heart swelling at the sight. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "Evening," Mrs. Crane replied, stepping forward. She held out a small pot with a daffodil inside. We thought we could help you replant your garden, if you'll have us." Harriet's breath caught, emotion tightening her throat. She looked at the faces before her, some hesitant, some hopeful, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "I'd be honored," she said, her voice steady. The neighbors filed into the yard, each bringing something to contribute: flowers, tools, pots of soil, small tokens of solidarity that carried immense weight. Together they worked to restore the garden, their laughter and conversation filling the evening air. Even Mr. Wilson helped, though he kept his distance, his hands busy with small tasks. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the garden began to take shape once more. Harriet stood at the center, her heart full as she watched her neighbors come together, their shared effort a testament to the power of community. When the work was done, the group lingered for a while, sharing stories and sipping lemonade on Harriet's porch. Jake and Katie sat beside her, their expressions lighter than she'd ever seen them. Harriet looked out at her garden, the flowers standing tall and proud against the fading light, and felt a deep sense of peace. The scars of the past weeks would remain, but they no longer defined her garden or her neighborhood. Together, they had planted something new, something stronger, and Harriet knew that whatever storms might come, they would weather them together. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and write in the comments where you are watching from. Don't forget to check out the other videos on the channel. Every story is worthy of your attention.